Hi, welcome to the data visualization section of this course. I'm Professor Ella, and we're going to be walking through some of the reasons why we visualize data today. The goal is to be able to help you tell stories, accurate stories, but effective stories on basically any data that you'd like. You'll come out of this section with the ability to accurately and effectively and meaningfully create and interpret graphics. As an added bonus, you're also going to be able to identify and get mad at some of the really bad graphics that exist in the world, and I promise you'll find some doozies. I'm going to show you one at the end of this slide, just presentation. So I'm going to start with some aspirational graphics. So these are graphics that you could eventually create if you decide to devote more of your time to data visualization. This is a set of graphics that show Senate polarization over time, and we start with 1989. And as you'll very quickly realize, I'm a political scientist. I love graphics that tell stories about politics. So here's 1989 Senate. Each point is one senator in Congress at that time period, and each line indicates a time that that senator voted with a connected senator. So, for example, you've got McClure and Armstrong, who occasionally voted together in the Republican Party. You can see that there's a lot of interconnection here. This is a very dense graphic. The Republicans and the Democrats, you can see that they're separate, but you can also see that they're voting together fairly often. If we move on to 1996 Senate polarization, you can see that the degree to which Democrats and Republicans are voting together is starting to go down substantially. And when we move to 2002, well, things actually seem to be getting better. The interconnections seem to be denser between Republicans and Democrats. But this is also the year after, immediately after 9/11, 2001, which was an unusually unified time period of the United States in the past 30 years. 2003, things break apart again, and the unification that we saw from 2002 starts to disappear. 2013, which is fairly close to modern days, and you see basically very little overlap between Republicans and Democrats in terms of how often they vote together. So those are some aspirational graphics. And I'm actually going to talk next about the graphics that we will create, but before that, I'm going to quickly go back to 1989, and just note that one of the reasons that we're seeing less interconnection is because there used to be Southern Democrats in Congress. Southern Democrats were relatively conservative Democrats who tended to vote with the Democratic Party on economic issues, but voted with Republicans on racial and some cultural issues. Over time, the Southern Democrats have been kicked out of office and replaced by Republicans, and that is part of why you see this increasing polarization. So let's talk about graphics that we will create, and that is going to be maps of the United States, specifically maps of political data about the United States. This is the 2004 US presidential elections at the state level, and a state is colored red if it voted in favor of George W. Bush for the presidency, and blue if it voted in favor of John Kerry. And you can see that this map looks overwhelmingly red. And well, Bush did win, but it turns out that this is more red than we'd really think is an accurate telling of the data. So one way to mitigate the accuracy of this graphic is to split it up into counties instead of states. And on top of that, this graph also shades each county by how strongly they voted for the Republican or Democrat. So lighter colors are now less strong votes for the Republican or the Democrat. You can see that there is a giant swath of red down the center of the United States. You can see the farming belt and the Rust Belt over here as well. And then you can see the coastal areas tend to be more blue. But this still might not be the right way to demonstrate this data. Here we've decided, or the author of this graphic has decided, to color code those counties instead of as lighter shades, to color code them as purple, the combination of red and blue. And so this is getting towards a graphic called Purple America, where you can see that instead of being a really intensely divided country in 2004, we're in fact a fairly purple country. And that actually holds today, as we'll see in the graphics that we make for 2014. But there was still yet another problem with that graphic, and that was that the middle of the country is incredibly sparsely populated. So even though there's a lot of really high percentages of people voting for the Republican candidate, and still are today, that doesn't mean that there's a lot of people in this center section who are voting for the Republican. So maybe we don't actually want to make them occupy that much space on the graph. This cartogram at the end shrinks counties that are very small. And here you can see a lot more purple and really big chunks of blue, because it turns out the really urban, really densely populated areas are very small geographically. They don't occupy much space, but they have lots and lots of people in them. So you can identify Seattle up at the top left, the Bay Area in the middle left. You can identify New York City on the top right, and other areas of this country that tend to vote very Democratic. So let's briefly talk about a bad graphic, and this one really makes me irked. This is an old news story, but it was a pretty egregious one. This was a graphic that was created and printed by Reuters, which is a really major news organization in the United States. They create a lot of the content for the articles that you read in your major publications like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. And this graphic shows the number of murders committed using firearms over time in Florida. And it highlights one particular instance. It highlights 2005, when Florida enacted stand your ground laws. Now, stand your ground laws, it said that if you're encountering a violent situation, you don't have an obligation to leave that situation. You can stand your ground and escalate however you think is necessary, so long as it's reasonable. Point is, you don't have to leave. You're not obligated to try and diffuse a violent situation. And this graphic, well, it looks a whole heck of a lot like the number of gun deaths in Florida went down after 2005. But that's not what it shows. Take a minute and look at this graphic. Pause the video, come back when you've figured it out. Okay, so hopefully you're back. The problem with this graphic is that the y-axis is all wrong. The y-axis goes from the top of 0 to the bottom of positive 1,000. So in fact, we normally see this graph flipped over like this. And here you can see the more accurate reflection, which is that the more accurate reflection of the data, which is that after 2005, gun death rates went up in Florida. And instead of blood dripping, looking like blood just dripping down the wall, it just looks kind of like a mountain under there. This particular graphic was particularly relevant because Stand Your Ground in Florida was associated with the exoneration of George Zimmerman, who was a man who killed an unarmed Black teenage boy in Florida, and he was exonerated based on Stand Your Ground laws. I look forward to going through graphics throughout the rest of the course. We'll come up with some good ones, we'll come up with some bad ones, and generally have fun trying to think through how to interpret data.